Hi all, let's have a look at the encounter between Magnus Carlsen, the current world champion, and the to-be challenger Sergey Karjakin. So they've got an upcoming World Chess Championship later this year. Let's see what happened in this game. So this is actually the first time they've played all year before the after it was known that Sergey was going to be the challenger for Magnus. So very interesting. E4 for Magnus. We see Sergey playing the Sicilian defense, so none of this Berlin defense, which might be arguably more solid. Knight f3, d6, c3. Now we see knight f6. Bishop e2. This pawn's not really attacked. Apparently quite a few people have fallen for this little trap. If knight takes e4, can you see what white plays? I'll give you 5 seconds. Yep, naughty little trap, check, and then we pick up the knight. Okay, g6, after casting it's still on that little trap. Bishop g7, check, and now d4. Again, this pawn cannot be taken. If it is, then d5, and potentially two knights are going to be hanging. For example, if black tries to unpin, then we've got both knights hanging there, so it's not a good idea to take on e4 again. So we see queen b6, bishop comes back, c takes. White has established a nice classical pawn center here. Now with d5, a little bit of extra space. Of course, some downside is the dark squares are a little bit weakened, but on the other hand, yeah, the space advantage and potential for e5, it's quite a pleasant position at the moment for white. Black voluntarily wants to give up the light square bishop to try and emphasize dark square play, potentially. Magnus obliges. We have now knight bd7, knight holding d7, that's possible. Rook b1. We see rook fc8, rook b1 made sure that the bishop can move more freely in the future. So we see now bishop c2, knight e5. Now, although moving to g3 is tempting, it looks as though queen e2 might actually be superior. And now we see knight fd7, bishop g5. Now the point of this move is not necessarily to win that pawn here. Black plays h6, encouraging white to take that pawn. It's a little bit risky and goes into complications which white doesn't really need to go into. On taking, g5 threatens to trap the bishop, and then white will be forced to play knight b5, and it gets a bit hairy after that. But Magnus is just content with creating some light square weaknesses. So we see bishop h4, g5, so some light square weaknesses, particularly f5 could be interesting. Bishop g3. Also, of course, f4 here with preparation, at the moment it's pinned, would leave some structural damage on the king side. Queen a6, wanting an exchange of queens. Magnus is not having that, even if it doubles pawns. Keeping the queens on is a nice idea here, because black's king has been slightly compromised. Now rook c4. This does provide some tactical ideas in some lines like rook d4 because of taking knight f3 check. Magnus avoids all that potential stuff with king h1, taking the king out of harm's way even more. Rook ac8. And superficially it looks as though black's got good pressure on the queen side. But what about his king here? And of course it does look as though as well that black's dark square campaign seems fairly successful. A lot of players would be quite liking to have a knight on e5. But let's have a look at the dynamics here after f4. Bishop takes f4. Some fractures here, isolated pawn which can be targeted quite easily actually with queen h5. So it's balanced. This dark square play is at the price of some light squares here. Queen b6. In fact, queen h5 now is played, not minding knight f6 because there's a clever entrenchment area which is, I believe, slightly unusual. The queen doesn't necessarily want to go to h4, it can be subject to harassment. It actually goes into that light square, and how can it actually be evicted from there? The queen is seemingly okay there, putting pressure on e5 all the time. We see now queen d8. Now here, it's too risky to take on e5 to try and win a pawn, because there's always things like knight. There's probably things like knight takes e4 here, hitting the queen. So, but the pressure's there on e5, ready at the right time. We see bishop b3, trying to evict the rook. Now, in this case, if rook c7, bishop takes here, this is actually quite safe, it seems. So, no major discovered attack on the queen. So the rook hangs around on d4 to support this tactical idea of knight takes e4 in that line. But nevertheless, bishop takes e5 is played anyway, not with the idea of winning a pawn, but liberating this pawn. This d6 could be very useful in some lines, opening up that bishop, pinning the f7 pawn. We see now rook bd1, queen d7, queen retreats. The rook goes to b4. It's moved a lot of times in this game. Rook d2, rook f8. And now, interestingly, now that e5 isn't so spectacularly useful for black, white actually crudely goes for a kingside attack with g4. But the question has to be asked, given that the centre is so solid now, how does black try and counter this? Basically, the plan is pretty crude. Rook g2, g5, open on g-file and slay the black king. a5. Note also in this position, this bishop, although not doing too much at the moment, has got the possibility of bishop a4 when black isn't looking and isn't protecting the a4 square. So if the queen ever wants to be dislodged from d7, that could be a useful option. At the moment, of course, the rook's holding a4. We see rook g2, so g5 on the cards. Black tries to put the brakes on that. h4, renewing g5. Rook b6, and now look at that a4 square. So this is another resource to add to white's collection here in the toolkit if he wants to be able to move the queen away. But first g5, king h8, and now just doubling rooks. This is really dangerous. Note also d6 is useful sometimes as well to open the diagonal. Here black played f5, which hastens to the end. Technically there might have been more stubborn defensive tries like rook g6, but f5 was played. We see queen h3 pinning that pawn to the queen, and it's just incredibly dangerous now because there's convergence of the two rooks and the bishop on g8 in some lines, with d6 and g takes trying to mate on g8 already. We have rook b4, g takes, bishop takes, and now queen g3 threatens, mating on g8 with queen g8 here. So for example, just to show a silly move, that'll be checkmate there. So yeah, the trebling is pretty dangerous, as you might expect. So knight f6, but now just queen g6 threatening queen takes h6. How does black actually defend this position? It's pretty terrible position to try and defend. Black tries knight g4, well, just plays the last move, knight g4, and of course white just plays, if I give you 5 seconds, what does white play here? Okay, just rook takes g4, yeah, just wipe out the defense there for queen takes h6 next. So overall, a very, very smooth looking attacking game from Magnus Carlsen here. He just seemed to, well, he seemed to not mind black having some dark square occupation for a while, but his light square installation, especially the queen on f5 and just opening up the g file, was used with dramatic and effective effect. So quite an amazing encounter. I hope this does not mean that the upcoming World Championship match between them will be lopsided in some way, but yeah, it doesn't bode too well from the evidence of this game that Sergey at least shouldn't be playing the Sicilian defense positions like this in particular. But anyway, maybe he's just hiding his preparation for the upcoming World Championship match. So try the Sicilian in this particular game. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that one. Comments or questions on YouTube, and likes appreciated. Thanks very much.